Thanks for coming out tonight. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Scott Thomas, who is one of the leading figures in the field of international relations and religion, and that's how I got to know him a little bit. A lot of our interests coincide. He teaches at the University of Bath, more specifically senior lecturer in international relations and the politics of developing countries, Department of Economics and International Development. And he's also a research fellow at the Center for Christianity and Interreligious Dialogue at Heythrop College at the University of London. So he gets around. He's part of Christian-Muslim dialogue in England, and he's taught in Italy, Switzerland, and South Africa, where he did his PhD research during the apartheid era. His PhD through the London School of Economics was about the role of the World Council of Churches and the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in the anti-apartheid movement, and that's where he got his interest in bringing together international relations with theology and with struggles for justice. And so he's been active in struggles against racism, apartheid, colonialism, and so on. One of his master's degrees is a degree in theology. So he's the rare combination of someone with competence in theology and in political science as well. And he's the author of the book that you see on the table over there, which I'd encourage you to get and read if you haven't already, The Global Resurgence of Religion and the Transformation of International Relations, which is one of the most important books on this question of religion and international relations and the new prominence that religion has had over the last couple of decades. And he's working on another book called God in a Global Age, Essays Toward a Critical Approach to the Study of Religion. And finally, then, just on a personal note, let me say how pleased I am to have him here. We've met on a few other occasions before, and I've really enjoyed Scott's warmth and personal generosity. And so after Scott talks, then we'll have time for question and answer and a little time for interaction with them. So please join me in welcoming Scott Thomas.
Thank you, Bill, for that generous introduction. I should also add that I was an undergraduate at the School of International Service, the American University in Washington, D.C. My first international relations professor was Abdul Saeed, who was a Sufi mystic. And my international relations lectures from the beginning, as a freshman, were part Sufi philosophy, part international relations theory, and part mysticism from Thomas Merton. And so you could say that I've kind of been mixed up in these areas for a while. What I want to do for you this evening is first talk about some general global aspects of religion and politics that are probably going to be part of the 21st century. Then narrow down a little bit to talk about a survey of religion and politics in certain regions of the world. But while I'm doing that, I want to do something else. The book I did a couple of years ago that's out in the back ends by saying that seeing the world differently is already a way of beginning to change it. To see what's going on in the world differently is already a way to change it. In other words, do we just, through the newspapers or other elements, try to say, oh, that's what's going on in the world, and now I'm going to add my Kantian ethics, my utilitarian ethics, my Catholic social teaching, or my Vincentian ethics, to the end of really was a rather straightforward, that's what's going on in the world approach. Or in fact, is the relationship between what's going on in the world and our interpretation of the world actually far more interrelated? So in fact, depending on how one's ethical formulation develops, the kinds of things we look for in the world to see what's going on in the world is also in fact helps us see differently what's going on in the world. So I want to probe theoretically along the way some of these kinds of elements. But let me begin with the four broad themes about the future of religion and international relations in the 21st century. The first is that around the world, whether you're talking about the southern United States, to the Middle East, to Latin America, it seems that religion is on the rise. It's growing in countries with wide varieties of religious traditions and levels of economic development. What that broadly means for me is that it means that neither poverty nor social exclusion is solely responsible for what's taking place. Given this is happening, like I say, in different religious traditions, but also different levels of economic development. So when I talk about the role of religion, the rise of religion, the resurgence of religion, I'm not really defining this as the growth of fundamentalism per se, which I'm briefly going to define as the kind of rigid adherence to a set of rituals and doctrines. But what I'm talking about is occurring through a wide variety of public rituals, private practices, personal ways of engaging with the world that shape meaning, identity, and understanding of what's actually taking place. And I think that'll become clearer as we go along. So the global resurgence of religion is one broad theme. The second has to do with demography, population, which is that demography is reinforcing this trend in global religion. That the global religious landscape in the coming years is going to be affected by a massive population shift from the developed countries of the North, mainly Western Europe, former Soviet republics, to the developing countries in what I'll call the global South. The North accounted for 32% of the world's population in 1900, 25% of the world's population in 1970, about 18% in the year 2000, but by 2050, it will likely account for 10%. In other words, the industrialized northern countries will only account for about 10% of the world's population. This is the origin of the terminology of calling the South the global South. And related to this is that religion has emerged as a driving factor in this kind of redistribution of population from north to south. In fact, theology is now one of the most accurate indicators of fertility. Eric Kaufman, who writes on demography and religion, talks about this. He says that far more than religious or denominational issues, far more than ethnic identities, theology, religion, has a more important element in determining demography. Why? Because frankly, more devout families have more kids than secular counterparts. In other words, more devout families, religious families, tend to have larger numbers of children. Now, this doesn't entirely mean that secular liberals are entirely dying out, but it does have some important consequences for the future. For example, what does this mean for Western Europe, Western secular Europe? Eric Kaufman argues that it may be the case that Europe may be more religious at the end of the 21st century than it may be now. That's due partly, yes, to Muslim immigrants, but it's also important to point out that Christian immigrants from the global South are another important part of Europe that often is missed amid all the publications and discussions of Islam. What it means is that the often bitter debate over religion and European identity, the relationship between religion and identity, the relationship between the boundaries of the sacred and the profane, religion and the state, religion in the public square. What do we mean by secularism or post-secular societies? interreligious dialogue. All of these issues are increasingly going to be a part of European politics. So this is a second important element. The role of demography from the north to the south. But the third important element has to do with religion is also increasingly going to be an urban phenomenon. The growing population in developing countries will mostly settle in the vast, growing, impoverished cities in the south, where religion is spreading. So most of the world's population will occur in these cities of the global south. So religion is following these trends in urbanization. What this is challenging are conventional notions of secularization. That basically modern science, reason, urbanization, education are going to produce more secular societies. But from Sao Paulo to Lagos to Seoul, from Jakarta, megacities, megachurches, mosques, and educated middle-class lifestyles all seem to go together with religion. And this wasn't necessarily supposed to be the case. Historically, religion has been very important in adapting to urban environments. Think about the Roman Empire and the early church. Excuse me. But also the Franciscans began an urban renewal movement in response to the poverty and inequality that accompanied the rise of the market economy. It may be that Islam might also follow this kind of path. Now, although urbanization can lead to civil unrest and offer cover for criminal gangs and terrorist networks, which is what security people are interested in, we also need to be aware that urbanization, the rise and spread of cities, offers tremendous opportunities for urban ministry to help prevent threats to security in the first place. The names of, say, St. Vincent de Paul, the Franciscans, might come to mind in this regard. But the point here is that the well-being of people, in the end, as an end, is more important than the means to support for our own security. So helping people becoming ends in themselves through their own human flourishing is an end in itself, not just because they support our own security. And this is true here as much as it is abroad. Another important aspect of the religious resurgence is a disintegrating relationship between the West and Christianity. But this is only one aspect of a more general trend. What I'll call the global transformation, the global restructuring of religion, in the way the main world religions are being delinked from specific culture, people, territory, through globalization. So it's common to see Christianity as a Western European religion, associated with the culture and history of the continent. In fact, this is only partially correct. Christianity evolved from its Jewish origins in Palestine, conquered the pagan world, then spread east to Iraq, India, China, before the Mongol invasions reduced Christianity to mainly being a Western or European religion. So the recovery of this kind of global optic in a global age, the discussions of world Catholicism, fit this kind of optic that we're now beginning to see in our accounts of understanding Christianity, its relationship to the West, and its relationship to other cultures. So it may be that Christianity is now going back to where it started in the first millennium, as a post-Western religion dominated by the peoples, the cultures, and countries of the global South. The Christian minorities in the Middle East may in fact be an exception. But the global spread of Christianity and the way it is being adopted and adapted to non-Western cultures is probably the most important transformation of Christianity since its initial period of expansion. And arguably, for the first time since the dawn of the global age, Europeans live in a world that is not of their making, and it's a world they cannot control. So because of these kinds of four trends, and demography, and the global resurgence of religion, urbanization, and the transformation or restructuring of religion, there are two main issues I want to keep in mind throughout the rest of the presentation. The first, that each one of these trends reinforce this conception I'll have of the religious world of the Global South. Not just the Global South, but the religious world of the Global South. That theologies and spiritualities are a way of the everyday approach to people living out their lives, their social worlds. What this means, and why I'm saying this, is because religion, what I'll call religion, is not just about doctrines and propositions, but the way religion intersects with culture in language, affects meaning, consciousness. The way religion is lived every day affects, therefore, notions of justice, notions of equality. The way people interpret their everyday lives, in other words. Doctrines about the nature of God, the presence of God in the world. The struggles for justice, emancipation, the problems of the environment are all going to be a part of the way people in the Global South seek to live faithfully amid each one of these kinds of problems. So this is a major point of engaging then with religion in other parts of the world and interpreting what's taking place. The other important theme here is that each one of these trends I'm talking about will shape the dynamics of existing, new, and emerging great powers. And they will also influence the efforts of the United States to promote freedom, to promote civil society, to promote democracy and social cohesion and economic development across the world. So with that kind of brief overview of some of the main themes, let me now talk about a couple of the regions of the world. The most dramatic religious explosion in the world today is by Pentecostalism, or evangelicalism and Pentecostalism. It's part of the demographic shift towards the Global South and a key factor in Christianity's global transformation. Now, for those of you who know about this in some of your writings, in the writings that have been done, you'll see that whether you're talking about evangelicals or Pentecostals, they tend to subscribe to the authority of the Bible, often interpreting it literally. And by authority of the Bible, it means authority of the Bible over against sometimes the tradition of the Catholic Church. But as I said, they take the Bible literally and they emphasize proselytizing. Now that sounds like a kind of basic definition. But again, I want to come back to a theoretical point here. There's no necessary relationship between taking the Bible literally and any kind of particular sort of politics. If we think about the fact that Francis of Assisi took the Bible literally, so he gave everything away and gave it to the poor. That's not the way in which all evangelicals interpret the Bible, dare I say. In other words, talking about the politics of literalism becomes very important in understanding religious movements. The notions of extremism, the notions of religious militancy. Francis also was militant and extremist. But you can be a militant extremist for peace. So taking religion seriously, mixing religion and politics, saying religion has a role in the public square, all of those are ways of engaging with religion that may or may not be linked to violence. And so merely talking about militancy and extremism as if it's related to violence, I think needs to be corrected. Or even if we think about a term as we'll come to this, Islamism. Islamism is a spectrum. It's not just one way of interpreting religion in public life. From the Taliban in Iran on one side to, say, Tunisia and the Islamic Party, the IKP, on another. Or in between, possibly, the Islamist movement in Tunisia. So there's a variety of ways of engaging with religion in the public square, in ways in which talking about this definition of literalism doesn't exactly fit. But having said that, the World Christian Database argues there might be something like 250 million Pentecostals in the world. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life says maybe something like 380 million, depending on how one calculates these terms. But it's interesting that after Catholics, they present the largest single group of Christians. And they predominantly live in, note these countries, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, the Philippines, and the United States. In other words, each one of these countries has a large number of Pentecostals. But 3 of these countries have substantial Muslim populations: India, Indonesia, and Nigeria. And so that's also the background for the rise of Christian-Muslim tensions. Because in these kinds of countries, the explosion of Pentecostal and evangelical Christianity has collided with Islamic revivalism or Hindu nationalism, leading to a variety of types of communal violence. Islam has also experienced a genuine revival. It's one that extends beyond Islamic fundamentalism. More and more Muslim women are wearing the veil. Men are wearing beards. According to the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, Islam is thriving, with 86% of Turks, 90% of Indonesians, and 98% of Egyptians reporting that religion plays an important part of their lives. If Turkey joins the European Union at some stage, the kind of so-called God gap, in other words, the religiosity of people, presumably in Turkey is much greater than it is in many of European countries, and so this has led to this notion of a God gap. Or so the terminology is used that way. So if Turkey then joins the EU, that means those series of issues now will be inside EU politics. However, the Pew Global Attitudes Project indicates in a wide variety of ways that religiosity among Muslims is quite consistent with a desire for democracy, globalization, and that basic human freedoms are also very important. And even before the Arab Spring, this was pointed out in the Arab Human Development Report. But they still believe, according to the survey, that Islam should play a prominent role in politics, even though it should be separated from government. And Iran's experiment in clerical rule has been considered a failure. For Arab Islamists, the secular regimes in Syria, Iraq, Tunisia have given secularism, in fact, a bad name, even if, as I say, the Islamic models are far more problematic. There is widespread support for economic elements of globalization in terms of markets, etc. But in fact, democracy in the Arab world may depend more on how any kind of political actors engage in the public square, whether they're religious or secular. Because any type of political movement, religious or secular, can be violent, intolerant, anti-democratic, rather than, like I say, specifically religious ones. We think about the AKP in Turkey, who is very pro-EU in its general attitude towards foreign affairs. And you think of the secular military in Turkey, which says that it wants to promote democracy, but sees itself as a guardian of democracy, but in fact has acted in very democratic ways. So this means that looking at a political movement's ideology, secular or religious, becomes important. How it engages the world becomes important, not merely if it happens to be secular or religious. It's also important to point out, to emphasize again, that the Islamic world extends far beyond the Arab world. That the largest Muslim countries are outside the Arab world and outside the Middle East, such as Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So very quick generalizations about Islam and women, Islamic violence, Islam and democracy really have to be picked apart. Really have to be picked apart. What about religious renewal in Asia? Remarkably, given its Marxist past, China has experienced a tremendous expansion, Pentecostal and evangelical Christianity. Some of you may know of a book that some editors of The Economist did a couple years ago called God is Back. It actually opened up the book with a series of studies looking at house churches in China, looking at, indeed, those churches among upwardly mobile, middle-class Chinese. The Center for Global Christianity projects that there may be something like 218 million Christians in China by 2050, maybe 16% of the total population. Even though right now they're a very small percent of the population, the question for China for the future is whether this domestic tranquility will continue, whether that minority status will maintain the same. But it's not a matter of the entire population or large elements of China becoming Christian. If Christianity achieved the kind of cultural permutation that you had in South Korea, which reached over like a quarter of the population, it could fundamentally alter China's political fabric. And so South Korea, whose Christian transformation was the most remarkable religious transformation of the 20th century, is important to look at also in relation, like I say, to China for this particular kind of reason. Let me also talk about now shifts and changes in Russia in the Orthodox Church. As you know, Russia is mainly an Orthodox country, but is enjoying a revival of over 70 years since communist oppression. But I think few have really appreciated the depth of the damage caused by communism, but also the depth of the damage by the post-Soviet era, the undermining of trust, undermining integrity, accountability, as well as the moral and cultural values. What's important here, therefore, is how we tell the story, how we tell the narrative of the end of communism in the Soviet Union. And this is important for interpreting Russia today, and the potent mix of Russian orthodoxy and nationalism. Because if we're interested in democracy, civil society, and social cohesion in Russia, the answer, in fact, may not be promoting religious freedom in Russia. One could argue that, say, a number of upstart Baptists from a country that's only been around for 200 years, the United States, trying to tell Russians who've been Christian for well over 1,000 years might be a tad arrogant. Indeed, the important point here is the role, therefore, of American Orthodox Christians, European Orthodox Christians. In other words, Orthodox Christians having lived in democratic, pluralist society, who from within the Orthodox tradition make an argument for how civil society, democracy, human rights are all a part of living faithful to the Orthodox tradition. In other words, theoretically, given the point I've just raised, that whole discussion of orthodoxy in Russia and Orthodox minority communities in European states or the United States raises an important area of research of the role of ethnic religious minorities in foreign policy, in very important and creative ways. I'm saying this because I come out of a tradition of moral speculation, moral interrogation called the virtue ethics tradition associated with Alasdair MacIntyre. What I said at the beginning of this presentation about whether or not we just see what's going on in the world and then add our Islamic ethics, our Kantian ethics, or our Christian ethics to the end of that, in fact, is what people in the virtue ethics tradition called quandary ethics. What virtue ethicists are concerned about is the way we probe the important questions of the day and how they ask, what kind of people, what kinds of states, societies do we want to be in the world? And so if you're interested in social cohesion, if you're interested in democracy and human rights, then understanding what it means to believe those things within the Orthodox tradition clearly is important for social cohesion. But moreover, it's also important for foreign policy. International relations as a social world of states, societies engaging with each other means that issues cannot be separated out. What I've just indicated to you about Russia in relationship to orthodoxy may also be important for U.S. cooperation in foreign policy issues like what to do about Syria. The kind of Iraqi narrative of democratic transition, overcoming intercommunal conflict, is a narrative that also includes almost half of all Iraqi Christians leaving the country, going into exile. That's not the model for Syria, for many people. It's not the model for those Christian communities. The Arab Spring was a movement concerned about good governance and democracy, but it was also concerned about authenticity in regional world politics. Authenticity in regional world politics, not based, dare I say, solely on oil. So one of the unintended consequences of the U.S.-led invasion in 2003 was the reordering of Sunni and Shia relations across the region. And of course, Saudi Arabia has a very important role, or sees itself having a very important role in Sunni Arab opinion. The fact that the Saudis also supported the Bahraini Sunni minority government is very important in that regard in terms of its repression. But the Russian Patriarch Kirill, the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church, who visited Syria and Lebanon, had his particular book on freedom and responsibility translated into Arabic. So the role of the Russian Patriarch, the role also of the Russian government in dialogue and working with the United States in relationship to Syria may be very important, but it's not disconnected from these other kinds of issues. And I say it's not disconnected because of something else. Libya. We're now concerned about the prospects of Islamic fundamentalism, Islamists, in Mali. This has to do with the return of the Tuareg fighters who are supporting Gaddafi, nowadays fallen, going back to Mali. The fact that somehow Middle Eastern politics and experts were somehow separated from African experts in North Africa led us not to understand this kind of interconnection. So they've been surprised of what's taken place in Mali. But as I say, if international relations is a social world, understanding the relationships between countries, how we develop those relationships, are not disconnected in different parts of the world. So if we want to work with the Russians as a great power, it means we have to understand their relationships in a wide variety of ways. And as I say at the beginning of this section on Russia and the Orthodox Church, the relationship between Russia and Orthodoxy goes back exactly to these kind of moral, cultural questions. And this is why the Russian Orthodox Church is now aimed at restoring these kinds of values and overcoming the modernizing and atomizing effects that have happened with the rise of capitalism in Russia. And a debate is actually taking place there on whether or not human rights is merely a Western conception. How are the democracy and human rights related to the Orthodox tradition? Again, this is very much the kind of question that does need to take place. It is taking place. And the role of Orthodox Christians outside of Russia, but a part of that tradition, are very important. So this is the kind of link I'm making between ethics, the development of understanding of the political, and of support for human rights, and how values, how justice, how human rights are interpreted. So I've very briefly talked about a couple of regions of the world. Another important area has to do with the global impact of religion. All the trends I've mentioned to you at the beginning are intertwined, interconnected with globalization. And they highlight the extent to which a more unified yet fragmented world is happening at the same time. Global and local regional identities are becoming linked because of globalization. But that's changing the very nature of religion and its role in international affairs. Some of you know that Sam Huntington talked about the clash of civilizations. And in many of his accounts, religions were cast as kind of static blocks linked together by culture, theology, and territory. But as I said at the beginning, one of the nature of the changes of taking place in religion, in the transformation, or as I've said, the restructuring of religion, has to do with the separation of cultures, states, and issues of territory, going all the way back to the Treaty of Westphalia and ended the wars of religion. So this kind of detachment of religion, culture, and territory becomes very important for interpreting now what religion's role in international relations is. It helps explain the rise, also a part of the rise of Salafism, or more extremist forms of Islamism, the development of evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity, which have emphasized doctrines rather than their relationship to cultures. And indeed, some of these types of religions, Salafism, conservative forms of Islamism, types of evangelicalism, in Protestantism and fundamentalism, are almost seemingly tailor-made for globalization, because they purport to expand on universal truths. But the nature of those universal truths are put in the concept of terms of doctrines and propositions. But what I've suggested to you, that in fact, the way in which religion functions and develops, the kind of cultural links that develop between religions, and the kind of links that link religion to territory, to interpreting the world, because of the role of language, the way it's embedded in particular societies, is also fundamentally important. And indeed, those analysts who've emphasized the linking of religion, territory, and culture, may, to some extent, emphasize more what I'll say, a generalization coming from Protestantism. In other words, the model for this is this development of fundamentalism in Protestantism. And I'm not sure that it actually as easily travels in the generalizations about one can make about Islam, but what one can make about Orthodoxy, or what one can make about generalization one makes about Buddhism. It seems to me that each one of these religious traditions around the world, the relationship between culture, identity, and place is still very important. So that's an important element of globalization and its relationship to religion. Another has to do with transnational religious movements, the Jamaat Tabligh and Hezbollah, two important global Islamic organizations. We could also mention Hamas. And the way in which certain analysts have tried to distinguish between the piety of certain movements, the politics of certain movements, and the terrorism of certain movements actually doesn't reflect exactly what I'm saying, the way in which the life worlds of peoples are engaged with each one of these religions, in which development assistance, military support, political engagement all get interconnected. In other words, the mixing of the sacred and the secular is nothing new. Piety and political struggles have often accompanied each other in the developing world. Now, some analysts want to argue that development of Sufism, Sufi brotherhoods, for example, provide a more moderate Islamic kind of engagement for Americans. But I think that requires to say that a rather short understanding of history. Sufi brotherhoods in North Africa, for example, supported Islamic resistance fighters against the French occupation in the 19th century. And even though Westerners find its blending of religion and politics uncomfortable, it's an important feature of the global South, with the overlap of the social and charitable organizations, politics, and even terrorist networks. In weak and failed states, plagued by corruption, this is simply going to go on into the future. But if that's the case, then it means, therefore, that looking at religion, what it means to live faithfully within each one of these traditions, the debate and the dialogue within those traditions becomes important for the future. So if one thinks about, for example, take a country like Algeria, where you have the Islamic Salvation Front, and its gradual movement away from violence was part of a theopolitical debate within Islamism in Algeria and what it meant to live faithfully within that country, which led to that kind of movement and shift. So those are the kinds of changes I'm thinking about. But it's also emphasizing what I said at the beginning, how the cultural and linguistic approach to faith, approach to religion and theology is very important because it underscores that of the way in which it informs how the world is interpreted. I'll say a little bit in closing about faith and foreign policy. Now, as the world becomes more engaged with religious issues in a wide number of ways, the relationship between religion and foreign policy, in fact, may become more important. Now, there are exceptions. Western states supported Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo. One can talk about, however, Germany's Catholics, who pressured the country to recognize Catholic Croatia's secession from Yugoslavia. The recent war between Russia and Georgia also is an interesting one insofar as it took place between two Orthodox states. It may be that this was the first such inter-Orthodox war since the Second Balkan Wars in 1913 put Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, and Romania against Bulgaria. But of course we could think also of World War I, which placed two-thirds of Europe's Catholics in opposition to each other. The European powers ignored Benedict XV's warnings against the idolatry of nationalism, and Catholic Christians' political vision of a united Europe was really only taken up after the Second World War. But the way in which faith and foreign policy has impacted Saudi Arabia is clearly important in its development of cultural diplomacy, its spreading, for example, of mosques, building of mosques in West Africa is also very important in explaining the more conservative form of Islam penetrating West Africa. You had for generations Muslims in West Africa, Christians in West Africa, living broadly in harmony. And the way more certain types of revivalist forms of Islam, the way Saudi engagement has helped undermine some of that harmony is an important question, I think, for the future. But also the issue of foreign policy and faith becomes important looking in the Chinese. Some of you are aware that the Chinese government throughout the world is funding a wide variety of what they call Confucian institutes. It's a very important way of Chinese soft power, its ability to try to influence developments in other parts of the world and get a better understanding of its particular conception of China. So looking at the impact of those Confucian institutes, an important role, therefore, it may play in Chinese foreign policy is an important one. But as far as the United States is concerned, Walter Russell Mead at the Council on Foreign Relations has argued that Christianity, he says, is the world's most pro-American faith. And he means by this the spread of evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity to many parts of the world. He says that the important part of the spread of evangelicalism globally is that it supports American beliefs and values, support for religious freedom, economic development, democracy, etc. I kind of scratch my head because I kind of think that Europeans support those values too. So it's not obvious to me why this would necessarily just be something that Americans would support. But the impact of religion on foreign policy, particularly in the United States and the States, I think also is indicative of an important shift in the development of American support overseas for concerns for both democracy, religious freedom, concerns for Darfur, human rights, human trafficking, etc., important American religious communities have been important in presenting those concerns, passing legislation in Congress on many of these issues, as you know. But this is really a generalization of something going back to the 1950s. I'm not sure if it's now in Harry Truman's memoirs, but he talks about getting these letters from grandmothers in Kansas concerned about Chiang Kai-shek in China. And Truman is scratching his head and saying, why is this going on? Well, it's because of Protestant missions and how those grandmothers went to those Protestant churches and supported Hudson Taylor, David Aidney, and a whole bunch of other kind of missionaries. That's why they're petitioning the president. But the legislation I just mentioned to you over the past decade on human trafficking, religious freedom, DAFAR, and human rights in North Korea are really a modern generalization of the expansion through the internet, the expansion through our knowledge of the way in which now American evangelicals have petitioned U.S. foreign policy in each one of these kinds of areas. It's probably true for the future that if one looks at that type of expansionism in the developing world, in the global south, that for both Muslims and Christians in the developing world, religion is going to be, in some respects, more socially conservative in relationship to abortion, in relationship to homosexuality. But arguably, it's also going to be more politically liberal in other ways, in the support of a rule-based international system, of rule-based norms, legally binding, with support for supranational institutions like the European Union, like the United Nations. Because having been on the receiving side of Western colonialism and imperialism, most of the Christians in these countries, the Muslims in these countries, understand the role of rule-based international law and the support for international institutions. The EU is very supportive here of its own vision of exporting a Kantian vision of perpetual peace. Or, as they like to say in Britain where I'm at, popular articles on the EU talk about the EU's normative power. Not military power, it's normative power, or it's civilian power. The truth may be that the EU may follow the IMF and the World Bank in foreign aid policy, but at least that's kind of the rhetoric. But it does raise a rather interesting question, given the way that the EU has not been very supportive of, shall we say, understanding its Catholic or its Christian foundations. That it might be possible to say that the role of the Vatican's foreign relations might be to try to help Europeans stay true to their fundamental values and promote those values in the global south. So what I've been trying to do briefly this afternoon or the evening is survey some of the great themes, some major themes that may be taking place in religion, politics, international relations in the 21st century. And very briefly, I've given a couple of snapshots of religious traditions and key regions of the world. But I've also, I think, tried to do something else. I've tried to probe how some of the more important theoretical questions of how we actually interpret precisely these kinds of events on religion, politics, and international relations. The kinds of stories we tell of what's taking place in religion and politics in these regions of the world. And in fact, trying to also emphasize that what it means to be faithful in the religious world of the global south is an important part of understanding religion and politics in the 21st century. Because in each one of these societies, in spite of some of the more conservative types of movements that emphasize a certain type of literalism in which certain values, certain doctrines may be separated, in fact, from the culture and traditions. In fact, for the majority of Muslims, Christians, and members of other world religions, how they interpret their moral lives, how they interpret the great problems of poverty, development, and justice in the 21st century are going to be an inherent part of their religious traditions, because through their religious traditions is how they interpret their own moral lives and their lives in the world. So with that, I'd like to close and open up for some questions. Thank you very much.
question. You've raised at least a half a dozen arguments that jump right into. So if you have questions, please do. Do you want to just field your own questions?
Sure, that's fine.
So thanks very much for that talk. My field of research is environmental science and studies, and certainly when you talk about these demographic trends, the first thing that jumps into my head is these trends can't continue. They're just not sustainable given the the resources of the planet. So how does that change your basic thesis if these these clear demographic trends of today rapidly, the rapid growth in the South rapidly starts, instead of accelerating, perhaps even plateaus quicker than expected, or even starts to drop?
By resource constraints, I'm simply saying that because the global South, or religious world of the global South, is, quote, going to consume like we are, what's going to happen? And it can't continue. Yes, you're right. Which is why I would argue that an important part of the debate, not that that's a part of the debate here, by the way, but that what it means to live faithfully in that kind of world becomes important for the future. Which is why issues of interreligious dialogue, why issues of simple lifestyle, why alternative approaches to economic development, local sourcing, etc., what it means to actually source locally, and what this means for the community, all become important for the future. And that means that greater dialogue between Christians and Muslims in the global South, as well in the North, become very important. And it means that those religious traditions at the bottom, who are operating with people at the bottom of the heap, shall we say, are very important a very important resource for information of the global political system, the global economic system actually functions. So where does knowledge of the world and what's taking place in the world come from? Does it come from the top, the IMF, the World Bank, or Bain Capital, or actually does it come from the bottom? If that's how you actually learn how the world works, if that's epistemologically how we learn the way the world works, then those people in secular organizations, but also particularly religious organizations who work with people at the bottom of the heap, have a tremendous resource exactly addressing exactly what you're saying in the dialogue between the North and the South for the future. And whether we like it or not, that's going to have to happen, I would probably argue.
Hello. I wanted to ask you why the tyrant governments in the Middle East after the Arab Spring were replaced by Islamic governments.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again, a bit louder?
I wanted to know why tyrant governments in the Middle East after the...
Entire governments?
Yes.
Tyrant governments. Oh, tyrant governments.
Yeah. Dictatorship. Why it was replaced by Islamic governments? Like
democratic governments?
Yes. When I was watching the Arab Spring, my belief was that the Arab youth was looking for a more liberal and democratic governments. But now we're watching in Tunisia and in Egypt, these governments have been replaced by Muslim, more of Islamist government. Why is that?
Well, I think it depends where you want to start the story. And I think one has to go back to the 1920s in the partition of the Middle East by France, by Britain. Remember, you had, yes, the story of Lawrence of Arabia. You had the development there of the possibility of the Arab revolt and the development of the suppression of that, the partition, as I say, of these countries eventually, that by neither Britain or France or the European powers were interested in democracy in these parts of the world. So, in fact, you've had a frozen system. And as long as the West got its oil, we weren't that particularly concerned about whether or not these countries were democratic or not. And so, the role of the notion of the Arab Spring, or the unthawing of the Arab world, is if everybody was frozen for all of these years. This is occurring, or has occurred, as the Arab Human Development Report said, because of the tremendous demands for education, for change, etc. But as I was saying at the beginning, it's not sort of liberal democratic change versus Islamic change. That the spectrum of movements, from the Taliban on one hand to the movements in Tunisia, I'm not that necessarily pessimistic about what's going to take place in a country like Tunisia. But the point is, whether you're talking about Tunisia, whether you're talking about Egypt, or any of some of these other countries, this is very much in process. It's very much in change. And it's not clear to me how much external intervention, frankly, actually needs to take place for the grounding of democratic institutions. Fred Halliday, my old professor at the London School of Economics, Middle East Studies, and sadly died last year, used to put it in rather earthy terms. He said, there's no Islamic way to remove sewage. And what he meant by that is that if you want to embed democracy in these countries, let those whatever versions of Islamists take over. They're going to discover that governance is a very difficult thing to do. That there isn't one set Islamic way of doing things. But what Egypt under Mubarak was doing for so long was scaring the Americans about his Islamists. So therefore, yes, they suppressed the Islamists, they suppressed the trade unionists, they suppressed liberals, they suppressed everybody. So we shouldn't be so surprised that the kind of debate, sometimes violent engagement that's taking place, is going to take place. And the best that the West can do, the EU can do, is on the margins of trying to support democratic institutions and others, but not prejudge which movements are nice and moderate because they support us and those that do not. It's going to take a great deal of time, but as I was suggesting also in the example of Algeria, but Tunisia is also a very important example because of the way in which Islamists there have been in exile. They've been in other kinds of countries. Ghanouchi was in London for a number of years, one of the leaders of the Islamic movement there. They understand the relationship between Islam and pluralism, probably more so than the Muslim Brotherhood, who have just simply been suppressed for so many years. But then again, in Egypt, the younger generation of Islamists with their iPads and Macs, etc., are quite different from the older Islamists. And so the kind of global engagement in that way that they will have with other young Islamists in other countries, I would be hopeful for the future. But again, that goes back, you see, to the theoretical argument I was saying, of simply saying it's not just Islam over there and democracy and civil rights and human rights on the other side. It's the kind of theopolitical debate that takes place within the religious tradition, within the political parties, that can only happen, though, in a free society. And over the long term, we would then get some of the kinds of changes that that the West might be able to handle. But the whole point is that the global South doesn't exist just for the benefit of the West. The time has been now coming for them to be agents of their own history, their own destiny. And for some in the West, for some in European countries, they simply may not like that. But that's tremendous hope for the future, for if you actually want to embed democratic institutions over the long term in their societies. Sure, and then...
Thank you for the speech that you've given. I'm a student here of international studies and political science, and I was just wondering, what exactly is the correlation between the rise or the resurgence of religion and the political disenfranchisement of communities where this is actually happening? If there is any correlation between religious resurgence and, say, political disenfranchisement.
I mean, if you mean by political disenfranchisement the fact that countries were not democratic and under various types of authoritarian rule, is that the kind of what you mean by that?
What I mean is that the people within these countries necessarily feel as though they do not have a voice within the global community, or that their secular governments were not providing social services or some of the democratic institutions that were available. So instead of being engendered towards these secular governments, they instead moved to religious organizations in order to get social services, say in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
I mean, I think when I talk about the religious resurgence, the rise of religion, I'm not narrowly linking it only to concerns about democracy and representation. That's part of it. But going back to the first period of independence in the 50s and 60s, a kind of modernizing mythology took place of what it meant to be a modern country, both in terms of democracy, economic development, representation, urbanization, education, etc. And that both in terms of economic development and in terms of, yes, political development, that has not been something that's taken place. It's been a failure, or hasn't been as positive as many people would like. So the religious resurgence that I'm talking about is more broadly about people engaging in a wide variety of ways in countries to support change, because in fact they interpret their own lives within this kind of framework. I'm not saying that as soon as you have religious freedom, all of a sudden, religion is going to go away. It's just a matter of how people are being mobilized. Yes, that's part of it. But by embedding the notion of my wider conception of religion and culture, the moral life, and how we live out those lives together, I'm saying a series of struggles, whether it's for democracy, whether it's how we deal with the environment, whether how we deal with poverty, living out that kind of moral life is inevitably going to engage these kinds of religious issues. Now, partly you're right, it's been politically motivated. But I think also as the time has gone on, the kind of what I'll call secular blinders that have sometimes gone off social scientists, they're recognizing the role of religion in a variety of ways in cultures that they hadn't necessarily seen it as being important before. And so they're seeing, therefore, a role of religion in development issues, religion in interreligious dialogue and cooperation, because they see that this is an important part of their communities. I did some work with the Development Institute in Denmark for a couple of years ago, and there's two women there, very secular. Clearly they were interested in gender and development. But they started to have this conference on religion and politics because as empirical scholars working with women in Africa, they scratched their heads, but these are Muslim women and they're Christian women. And for some reason, not our case, but for them, their religion was a part of how they understood their lives within those societies. So I think it's a holistic series of areas and ways in which religion is a part of politics. One could go on at different more international trajectories and talk about some of the religious background, say, to the rise of human rights discourses, or even some of the religious engagement that led to the founding of the United Nations. But I think that's a separate story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, or I think you had a carp. And then,
I had a kind of methodological question that popped into my mind when you began, because so many people have a hard time accepting a complex reality and are more comfortable with something that's black and white, as we say, or even grayscale, without any colors or nuances. And do you have any suggestions about how to deal with people who say, well, we're right and you're wrong? That's all. How can you have dialogue with...
you mean methodological dialogue?
Yes, it depends, it seems to me, on a certain level of education and awareness and so on. That's my concern.
Yes. I mean, that's a good question. And I think that sometimes scholars from different methodological orientations do have trouble being in dialogue with each other. Part of that might be related to what people are deciding to look at or what factors they actually think is important. Those who just seem to be looking at quantitative indicators need to provide proxy variables. And even if the proxy does not seem to necessarily be that good, but as they say, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I think that a more charitable view would be to recognize that maybe there are different facets of a problem in which different types of methodologies can be beneficial. So I've got a colleague in Israel, Jonathan Fox, who does work on issues of religious freedom, but he was trained at the University of Maryland. He's a number cruncher. I'm not, but what he's actually done is actually calculated certain types of religious freedom in different countries around the world and created these indicators. And so at least if one wants to get a kind of picture of what types of restrictions on certain types of freedom might be important, then that kind of research is valuable. And so I think if one is open to recognizing that certain type of indicators can be important to giving certain types of information, that becomes, I think one could be open to that. But I guess my own orientation as a constructivist one is simply, as I've said, that I see political, economic relationships, I even see markets as social relationships. If you want to talk about the efficiency of the market, part of that efficiency, if you want to call it that, is not mechanical. It's actually based on, dare I use a word, honesty, transparency, accurate information. If those markets are to be efficient. But that's about a relationship, isn't it? And so this is why in the aftermath of the economic crisis since 2008, there's all kinds of research now being done on, dare I say, virtue ethics in the economy, the role of ethics, the role of the moral context of the market, precisely because of what's happened. So within my own constructivist orientation, I think one would then have to recognize where, in fact, certain types of hard data may, in fact, be useful, but even to recognize within that facts are complicated. So even if you want to talk about national income statistics, consumption, investment, etc., who decided that we're going to actually collect the numbers on those things, that those things are actually important in the economy? It's Keynes's general theory. You had to have the theory before it could tell you what hard numbers were important. Similarly, the human development indicators that the United Nations uses. which is the background of, say, the Arab Human Development Report. Well, you had to have a concept of human development, which would first then lead you to decide what indicators you were then going to use. So the role, therefore, of some of these different theoretical, methodological orientations, I think, one has to be maybe eclectic, and open to, in charitableness, to what you can learn from other scholars who may have a different orientation than your own. But that kind of charitableness, dare I say, doesn't always occur between academics.
Hello. I'm a student here, and I'm studying communications. And when you spoke about Christianity being the most American faith supporting the beliefs and values, and you commented on it being European as well, that really got my attention. I was wondering if you could go on a little bit about that and what makes you believe that it's more specific to America and Europe.
The idea that these issues of democracy and freedom, etc., that American evangelicals support, and that therefore the spread of American Christianity is good for American foreign policy, was the argument basically of Walter Russell Mead at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And so my comeback to that was that all of those values he's talking about, as far as I know, Europeans support too. So it's not clear to me why those values should just, or the spread of Christianity in that sense, should just be good for American foreign policy. That's really what I meant.
I want to try to take a stab at interpreting what you're saying and against the background that you speak, and then offer a suggestion and elicit a comment from you. My understanding is that you want to bring religion back into relevance in political and international relations analysis, which I think, the beginning of your talk was great because it really makes you think. It occurred to me, though, as you went on, and I see your interest in McIntyre and the virtue ethics and kind of like practical politics, practical getting things done. And your suggestion, I think, which is that lots of religious people are good at this. That maybe the task, and maybe I speak here as a theologian, maybe the task for a lot of these religious people is to prove the relevance of politics to them, because it seems to me that a lot of, say, the local initiatives that I think you were favoring, and that was brought up regarding population, all these other issues, that politics conventionally understood, let's say, of the nation state, becomes less and less important. I don't want to say that nation states aren't important. They organize power and they organize us. But on the other hand, it seems to me, and I guess I'd be following McIntyre in this, that the more real and the more practical and important and forms of self-making, that's a word that McIntyre uses, that occur in the world, the nation state and politics and rights and democracy and representation gets in the way a lot of times. And I feel like this is why he's trying to put forth this non-state-centered politics. And it just seems to me difficult as an analyst of international relations, where almost by definition you deal a lot with nation states, to figure out the relation, or even, dare I say it, the increasing irrelevance of conventional state politics to these really interesting movements on the ground that you're trying to track. That's all I'm going to say, and I hope it's relevant enough to your talk to elicit a thought. I think up to a point, or I wonder if up to a point, the emphasis, or dare I say the emphasis on procedure. I'm thinking of someone like Michael Sandel and his work on the procedural republic, on the way in which, well, let's just get the procedures right, they're open, they're democratic, and then everything is going to be fine. That in fact, that the role of individuals and their moral development and how they engage with others in the world is actually an important part for the effectiveness of those kind of procedures. What comes to my mind is maybe a partial kind of response, is that when I did introductory politics, we learned about democracy as multi-party elections and all of these standard criteria in a basic textbook you read and then you fall asleep. Okay? But they come from people like Robert Dahl, Schumpeter, etc. And that's the generalization in the textbooks you'll find. It turns out that such definitions are not nearly as value neutral as we think. Studies have been done of, say, the American Political Science Review, going all the way back to the beginning, of looking at all the articles on democracy. And then you go to the 1930s. And then the studies are also done to the textbooks on politics of the 1930s. And you discover a distinction between what's called procedural and substantive democracy. And maybe it's not so surprising that the articles in the American Political Science Review, not coming from Moscow, that there was deep concern of whether you could have functioning democracy and democratic procedures with great levels of poverty and inequality. And this was found in both the articles of the American Political Science Review and indeed some of the textbooks at that time. But then, going on a bit further in history, yes, we get Dahl and we get Schumpeter, and we get the Cold War, and somehow the idea that poverty and inequality could affect the impact of democracy sounds just a little bit too socialist. And so that gets exercised, and so we end up with this procedural definition of democracy, which we now think is value neutral, but in fact in its actual origins was all but value neutral. But of course what I'm saying is a very relevant story, because I think it was last year George Packer had an front page article in Foreign Affairs arguing about the problems of democracy in the United States because of the levels of inequality. And indeed, as some of you know, a lot more study now is done in the relationship between inequality and democracy. And so after half a century, have we come full circle to maybe some of those insights that go back to the 1930s. So that's the kind of reflection I have on what you've said. But certainly, if you're talking about Latin America, portions of Africa too, this issue of inequality and development and democracy become, I think, very important, and not just the emphasis on procedures.
I have a kind of a query that would focus on demography and geography and then harmony. So I kind of put those three together. Thank you for your enlightenment in terms of the complexity of our global community. But when you were speaking, I couldn't help but reflect on some visits that I've had to Toledo, Spain. And I think, if I'm correct, in the era maybe around the 16th century or 15th century, somewhere around that area, it's my understanding there was a fairly harmonious interfaith existence from a society standpoint. Muslims, Christians,
Andalusia.
and Jews all lived together, and I would suspect that even in that era, that would be considered an urban center, perhaps. So, in light of your projections and your forecasts of the shifts to the global south and urbanization as part of your major themes, I was curious if you thought that there would be a forecast or a prediction that you would be comfortable making or commenting on. And can we learn any lessons from a historical perspective on how a society can live harmoniously as it did in that era?
I mean, the period you're talking about is right, in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews are considered to be people of the book. But it's still true that in Muslim Spain, up to a point, Jews and Christians were second-class citizens in a way that would not be, shall we say, satisfactory today. Having said that, for the times, you're right, that's a kind of that's an important model that many have gone to. But so I think that in mining those kinds of lessons and the limitations of those lessons, but the relevance of those lessons would be important, I think, certainly for the future. But let me give you another example, and this is Poland. At the time of the St. Bartholomew massacre in France, you had the debate there going on between the Catholics and the Calvinists. You had the development in the Polish parliament of religiously plural institutions and the development of religious toleration. And since the change in 1990, there have been all these discussions of supposedly what Eastern Europe could learn from Western Europe. But I tend to be one of these folks that sit back and think, well, maybe there are some lessons that Western Europe can learn from Eastern Europe. And I look at that kind of Polish experience that up to a point I wonder is worth exploring a little bit more. And of course, Poland didn't survive as a state, etc. All kinds of things happened, which made Polish democracy not effective. But the fact that you had this juxtaposition at the same time, the St. Bartholomew massacre, it just gives me a little bit of pause, shall we say. We're almost out of time, but I think we might have time for one more.
Thanks for your comments. My question, I think, is pretty open-ended. I heard in your lecture you're making reference to Orthodox Christianity and to evangelical Christianity. I was wondering if you can place Catholicism perhaps into this matrix and these trends, both in terms of its influence, but also in ways in which this mix of forces is going to perhaps have an influential effect upon the Catholic Church in its own points of emphasis. For example, there's a renewed emphasis on evangelization within the Catholic Church. Perhaps that's coming from the competitors and the Pentecostal side. Is any comments on that?
I think, for all the talk about the Catholic Church and its dialogue with Islam, I think at least the Catholic Church, as I understand it, I would understand it under the current Pope, the concern for unity with the Orthodox world, the development of closer relationship with Orthodox countries, and understanding the Christian foundation, the foundations of Europe, being more central than just relations with the Islamic world, as important as that is. I think that one of the things I didn't say, a lot of things, of course, I couldn't say, but by some projections, some do argue for a kind of orthodox implosion in terms of population, in terms of the lack of expanding numbers. And so that's a cause of concern for the future. I don't know what else to say beyond that. Were you thinking of some other kind of larger kind of picture?
Well, thinking also how the Catholic Church is shifting now for itself as well.
Yes. Yeah.
In fact, I read a news article recently how Benedict has invited more cardinals from the Third World for the first time as part of the College of Cardinals. Yeah. Some of those trends.
Yes, I mean, at some point, the increase, as it's happening already, the increasing, shall we call it, the complexion of the Vatican, maybe indeed someday the complexion of the Pope, is going to reflect what I've just indicated. This global, the religious world of the global South, which includes, therefore, very much the kind of Catholic world. So in that sense, all of the trends I mentioned at the beginning are in many ways characteristic also of the Catholic Church and its kind of dynamic, which is why I also think into the future Catholic diplomacy and the Catholic Church. Well, I would even argue that very much the Vatican now, its support for international law, international institutions, etc. Not that its support for these things is always prominent in debate here among Catholics, but certainly the Vatican's own support and diplomacy for international law and organizations and norms is a key part of its understanding of the world. And I think as the kind of things you've said go on in the future, that's only going to get stronger.
So before I ask you to join me one more time in thanking Scott, I just want to put in a plug for a few other events that are coming up for the Center of World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. We have a talk on the Catholic Church in China by Regina Wolf of DePaul's Institute for Business and Professional Ethics on February 7th. There's a talk by Saren Foster on the feminist pro-life movement. And then there's World Catholicism Week in April 14th through 19th. The subject this year is Borders of Baptism, Multiple Belongings, and Transnational Processes of Catholic Formation. And Sister Helen Prejean will be speaking, Stanley Hauerwas of Duke University, the famous Vatican journalist John Allen, and Bishop Farid Taban, founder of Holy Trinity Peace Village in Sudan, will be here. So that promises to be a tremendous event. There's brochures over there if you want to pick one up on the way out that give places and dates and so on. But right now, please join me in thanking Scott one more time for a wonderful talk.